So, the films that I have chosen for my PowerPoint presentation is Father of the Bride and Father of the Bride Part 2. And I titled this PowerPoint presentation A Tale of Two Martins because I feel that the comedic performances of Steve Martin and Martin Short make these films truly great. So, let's get into it. So first we'll start with the major players, of course. First off, we should mention director Charles Shire, who directed both Father of the Bride in 1991 and then Father of the Bride Part 2 in 1995. And in Father of the Bride, of course, George Banks is the main character, who is played by Steve Martin. And Diane Keaton plays his wife, Nina Banks. Their daughter is Annie Banks, played by Kimberly Williams. Kieran Culkin, a young Kieran Culkin, plays Maddie Banks. And her husband-to-be, Brian McKenzie, is played by George Newbern. And of course, Martin Short plays the outrageous Frank Egelhofer. And his assistant, Howard Weinstein, is played by B.D. Wong. And if you look at Father of the Bride Part 2, it is all the same original cast members, which on the surface might seem unoriginal or boring, but actually a lot of what makes these films great is the consistency shown throughout both Father of the Bride Part 1 and Part 2. So let's move on. On being George Banks. So in Father of the Bride, the original, Part 1, George is going through a lot of life changes and is learning to let go of Annie, his daughter. And in this film, there's a lot of exaggeration, and George is able to convey a lot of emotion and expressions with his face. And part of what makes George so great is that he's vulnerable, he's relatable, he's funny, and it's raw. And I think this scene in particular showcases a lot of those emotions well, so let's take a look. Nina, his wife, sort of grounds him and keeps him real through this whole process. He goes through quite a wide variety of emotion, and the great thing about Steve Martin is that you can watch all of these emotions take place on his face. So we'll skip ahead a little bit here.
We are gathered here together.
Could think of was the part I had to play. Then suddenly I went blank. I had one line and I couldn't remember it. When the Reverend said, "Who presents this woman?" was I supposed to say, "That's me?" Or was it, "I do?" I couldn't think. I felt every eye in the place boring into the back of my neck, waiting for me to screw up, when suddenly it was upon me.
Who presents this woman in holy matrimony?
I do.
Annie and Brian, you have come here today to join your hands.
Who presents this woman?
Always
This
remember,
woman.
This vow of marriage is most solemn.
But she's not a woman, she's just a kid. And she's leaving us.
With a deep realization of its obligations and responsibilities.
I realized at that moment that I was never going to come home again and see Annie at the top of the stairs. Never going to see her again at our breakfast table in her nightgown and socks. I suddenly realized what was happening. Annie was all grown up and leaving us. And something inside began to hurt.
Okay, so we'll stop right there. Just goes to show the range that Steve Martin has as an actor, being able to play those really funny parts as a comedian and doing slapstick, and then the really real and raw, vulnerable emotion that he's able to show. So that's learning to let go. And in Father of the Bride Part 2, George is learning that life goes on. He learns that he's going to become a grandfather and a father again for the first time. So he goes through more life changes and a wide variety of emotion all over again. And we'll watch some of those emotions and how he's processing it here.
For George Banks, life was good. It was wonderfully, uneventfully predictable.
Hey, Dad, did you hear the news?
What news?
But not for long.
Hi, Dad.
I know what it is. You bought a house, right?
I thought you guys were going to have a baby.
Get out of here.
Tell him.
I'm going to have a baby.
Congratulations, Grandpa.
Again, we see the emotion that he shows in his face.
Now it's out.
Says so much.
Young, right?
It's bitchin'.
Bitchin'.
In with the new.
Hey, what do you think? I look like the guy you married, right?
Kinda.
So another example here of exaggeration and
You're gonna have a baby. He's right back where he started.
Excuse me.
a little bit of deadpan humor.
I was just adjusting to being a grandfather. I think I'm gonna faint.
Honey, I need to know how you feel about all this.
They don't have hot dogs.
George?
I feel super about it.
So we'll stop it there. And again, in that last scene, there was also some utilization of good camera work in following George's gaze outside of the car to watch what he was watching, so to speak, in the negative exchange between the ill-behaved little boy and his father. So really kind of helped us to feel what George was feeling. And we'll move on. So the types of comedy that were commonly used in Father of the Bride are exaggeration and satire. And that is well executed by the scene in Father of the Bride where George has the hot dog bun incident. He's on the verge of a breakdown from paying for Annie's expensive wedding, and so he gets arrested at the supermarket for refusing to pay for hot dog buns that he feels he doesn't need. Now let's just remember, satire is a form of comedy that mocks human weaknesses or aspects of society, and exaggeration, which is marked by intense character or condition. So let's take a look and see how these types of comedy are shown in this clip.
Nina said as long as I was escaping, would I mind escaping to the market and picking up something for dinner? Sure, that was all I needed. A busy supermarket. I needed to drive, mellow out, get my mind off the wedding. But mellowing out was not in the cards.
Excuse me, sir. What are you doing?
I'll tell you what I'm doing. I want to buy 8 hot dogs and 8 hot dog buns to go with them. But no one sells 8 hot dog buns. They only sell 12 hot dog buns. So I end up paying for 4 buns I don't need. So I am removing the superfluous buns.
I'm sorry, sir, but you're gonna have
So
to
this
pay
is a
for all 12
classic
buns. They're not
example of exaggeration by ripping open bags of hot dog buns in a supermarket aisle, along with satire, because we've all complained at one point or another about the amount of hot dogs and hot dog buns always being unequal.
Rather than make a stink. Well, they're not ripping off this nitwit anymore because I'm not paying for one more thing I don't need. George Banks is saying no.
Who's George Banks?
Me.
We can also see his use of
Why don't we just calm down?
physical
now, sir?
comedy,
I'll tell you why we
mannerisms,
because you're not
gestures.
It takes 2 people for a we to calm down.
He is full of expression.
That I don't
He
know,
uses
sir.
his
I'm
whole
just
body
the
to convey
assistant
humor.
manager of a supermarket. But I'll tell you this: if you don't pipe down and pay for those buns, I'm going to call the police. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's right. Hey. Right. Hey. Hey, come here. Come here. Come here.
So we'll go ahead and keep moving on. And in Father of the Bride Part 2, Martin Short really comes out swinging in Father of the Bride Part 2. He's great in Father of the Bride as well, but in Father of the Bride Part 2, we really get to see his talents on display. The types of comedy that are commonly featured in this film is farce and exaggeration. So in this particular scene, we're watching Franck try to talk George into getting some rest by taking some less than legal sleeping pills from his home country. The sleeping pills are called Vatsnik, Vatsnik. And a farce, if we will recall, is a comedic form that may include fairly outrageous plots, unlikely and absurd circumstances, frantic paced action, mistaken identities, etc. And this scene that we are about to watch, it's a little bit lengthy, so I'm going to just try to pick and choose the highlights, is a classic example of farce in cinema, even including the car chase. So let's watch.
And it's freezing kitchen.
What's about it, George? You look a little pooped.
Oh, I haven't slept in 3 days. I try to sleep at work, but I keep thinking any minute one of them's going to go into labor, and I just end up
Totally tired. Trust me, I know the feeling. And you know how I spell relief? Vatsnik.
Vatsnik.
Vatsnik. The best sleeping pill in the whole wide world. I swear by that.
Oh, no, I don't take sleeping pills.
Oh, George, you need your rest.
So we're going to move forward a little bit, but Franck convinces George to take the sleeping pills,
Hi, Dad.
and we'll see what happens next.
Good.
Ann, how you feeling?
Great. Really energized. Brian's coming home tomorrow.
Don't think we'll see any action tonight?
Don't think so, Dad.
Hey, honey, how you feeling?
Oh, good. Fine. Went to the doctor today.
Ann?
And right on schedule. 3 weeks.
Here goes.
Dad, what are you taking?
Well, Dad hadn't been sleeping so well lately, so I thought I'd take a couple of very mild sleeping pills. Please pass the rules.
Dad? What's he doing?
George! George!
I never saw anything like it. He said pass the rules. By the time I passed him, he was gone. George!
So we'll fast forward to see what happens next. They are trying to revive George, but this is classic examples of absurd circumstances and physical humor,
Goodbye, George.
absurdities.
I'm gonna take the ball, you know. We'll throw these out. Making I'm a gum. You took the muzzle fans?
That fate to me.
Matthew, help me got them into the office.
So they're trying to move George. This involves some physical comedy between Martin Short, who is smaller in stature than Steve Martin.
Frank?
Yeah.
Is he breathing?
Yes, breathing. Andrew.
Dear.
There you go.
Well, what are Vatsnik anyway? I've never heard of it. Are they prescription?
Not yet. They're from my country. They're not exactly legal. But trust me, there are no funny side effects. I've been taking them for years.
So we'll keep going. And of course, in the meantime, Annie goes into labor,
Are you sure?
adding a sense of urgency to the situation. And in that moment, Franck realizes that he needs George to be awake and in control of the situation. So that's what he tries to do.
You're gonna be that grandfather. Oh, George, don't do this. I am not the husband. I am not the father. I'm not the 911. Why is it shining big white head man? All right. Oh, there we go. All right. Look at that. Oh, run away. That's all. Now it's.
So Martin Short here is doing a lot of improvisation, showing his talent. So they finally get George to the car, and is the proverbial car scene.
How's the maternity department doing?
I'm hanging in there. Just hurry, please. Make a left here. Left here.
All right.
And then they encounter some gangsters, which is a good use of satire in this scene as well.
Hey, man, what's with that face, huh? Is that supposed to be me? Hey, you got a problem, loser?
They have no problem with nobody, just leave us alone.
Leave you alone? What are you, a tree?
Yes, I am. That's far up on there. Obviously, come on. Very good. Nobody look at that.
Hey, that's a nice accent, man. What planet are you from, huh?
Not planet. The planet of not wanting to die by a tripod shooting. Like the doors. Get it. Get it.
So they make it to the hospital,
It's fucking almighty.
and they get Annie to a room.
State exam.
And in the interim, there's a case of mistaken identity, and George stumbles into a chair that is meant for a patient
Oh.
who is going in for a prostate exam. So let's watch.
We got the pregnant lady here. We can move on.
You doing okay?
Contractions about 5 minutes apart.
Okay, hold on. Miss Cherry's gonna leave. You gonna be in the chair too?
No, I'm fine. See you after. Definitely.
Okay.
Where you want to go?
I don't know. He was just here.
Bring him on in. Ready? Excuse me. Do I know you?
Okay, so at that moment, George is very much awake. So, in review, Father of the Bride, Part 2, grows very naturally out of the storyline of the original Father of the Bride, in the sense that it's just sort of an extension of the foundation of what the original movie was about. And a big part of the reason for the success of these films is, of course, that the director and all of the original cast members were also a part of the sequel, which just added to the consistency, the continuity, and made them great. Father of the Bride Part 2 is a standalone film, but it just makes for a richer and more full movie watching experience to have watched the original, because there's so much character reference and basis for what happens in Part 2 that you're just missing if you haven't seen the original Father of the Bride. Father of the Bride Part 2 also captures the full flavor and spirit of the original, and it evokes all the same feelings of nostalgia that Father of the Bride was also able to capture. That includes the song that you're listening to now, which is a cover of the song The Way You Look Tonight that is sung by Steve Terrell. It was co-written by Charles Shire, and Steve Terrell was also an artist and a part of the soundtrack on Father of the Bride Part 2. So that was kind of an interesting and different way that they incorporated that same feel into Father of the Bride Part 2. As far as George Banks goes, the main character, he is funny and lovable and relatable to watch. His character is consistent between both of these films. No matter what circumstances he is going through, it might be very different life circumstances, but his reactions to them are always the same. And, of course, the on-screen chemistry between Steve Martin and Martin Short is nothing short of cinematic gold. And I'll take this quote from George Banks that he relays in Father of the Bride, where he says, "Well, that's the thing about life, is the surprises, the little things that sneak up on you and grab a hold of you," which is part of what this story is, I think, all about, and why it strikes a chord within all of us, too, so many years later. So the lesson is that relatability makes us laugh and it makes us cry. But most importantly, it's what makes us human. And to let go is to gain everything. I've cited some of the references that I've made this presentation with, and it was a real pleasure to work on this project. I hope that you were able to enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. And thank you.